Welcome, everyone. This is Pat Bailey, Director of Training here at Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. You're joining us for our 2017 Town Call Series. Today we're going to be talking about stepping up to global LGBT monitoring. This is a broadcast audio call that's going to run from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific, so make sure you've turned up your speakers or your headsets on your computer and turn the volume up so that you can hear it. You can use the chat box over on the left-hand side to chat in questions or response to any other questions or comments. Please make sure that you do that. If you have trouble signing in, chat me in and I'll be able to give you a number to call into and the access code. We will be recording this session and it will be available along with the slide deck handout. After the call, you'll receive a follow-up email. A couple of announcements before we get started. Reminder that tomorrow, March 31st, is Transgender Day of Visibility. We used Gina's video there to talk about being out and being visible and the importance, and she had some great history points on that. We are also starting next Monday, April 3rd, Building Bridges 201, which is our 3-part, 1-hour fee-for-service webinars. There's information on the website to look at that. We're going to look at next month on April 27th about the ROI for health benefits for your transgender employees. In May, our town call is going to be on global perspectives, and in June, we're going to take ERG-BRG development. Of course, the summit's coming up in October up in Philadelphia, so be sure that you check that out as well. Lots going on, outandequal.org. Get to know you a little bit as the audience. We've got a poll that we'd like to include here, and says, does your organization allow staff to self-identify their sexual orientation or gender identity? So you can include your answer there and hit submit with our polls. We have about 80 on the call right now, and so your options are yes, your company does allow staff to self-identify on their sexual orientation or gender identity, and we'll talk about the ways that that can happen. No, but you plan to. No and no plans to, not sure, or not applicable on that. So it looks like we've got about 2/3 of the audience has responded so far. Remember to hit the submit button. And it looks like well over half of the audience is doing self-ID at this point. And then it's kind of an even split between no, not, but planning to, no plans to, and not sure. So that's always great information. So we'll give that just another second or so. Yeah, it looks like about 55%. On your second poll, we're going to give you a chance to self-identify here on our call. So how do you identify? You can select all that apply on this one and go ahead and select those, and you can put in as well on the submit button to see those. And again, having those multiple intersectionalities of identities, this just being the LGBT spectrum along with allies, there are in there. If none of those answers fit for you, go ahead and chat in your answers in the chat box, and we'll be able to see those. And looks like we've got, almost everybody's in already on this. 40% identifying as gay, about 16-17% as lesbian. Allies, 32%. Thank you very much for being part of the call and joining us today. We've got one comment come in from Autumn, non-binary. Bisexual 10, transgender 4, queer 14.1. So thank you very much for all those inputs. I want to give a little bit talking and setting up the framework for today about self-ID and what it is, background-wise. We know that the government has mandated that gender and race be reported under federal equal opportunity laws, and that in the last couple of years, military, veteran status, and disability reporting has been federally asked for as well, with that being an option to reply. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not protected and are not tracked by the federal government, and there's only 20 states that protect both sexual orientation and gender identity. So any of the work that we do around sexual orientation or gender identity, SOGI, S-O-G-I is the abbreviation, that is voluntary. We also see as we look at self-ID around the world, some countries like France have very strict privacy laws on asking for this data, and so it's difficult even though the country is supportive to be able to ask that. And then we have that other side where it's, if a country is not actively supporting or engaging LGBT employees, that it would be difficult to ask those questions. And times it could be a risk because your entire work file, for example, would have to be submitted for visa consideration going to a country. For LGBT self-ID, the high levels, and I know that our panel will talk about this a lot more, about HR records, which is recorded for the individual, or engagement or satisfaction surveys, which is anonymous and tends to be trend data. There's a lot of questions that come up around self-ID, around privacy and use, How does someone ID after they transition? Do they still identify as transgender, or do they say now I'm going to identify with the male or female in terms of gender? What's marriage done to this work? And these are some of the questions that we'll get to. We get an opportunity to track how many same-sex marriages there are, but that also then ignores in demographics the singles. And what about ID for our allies? How about self-IDing there? A little history about this work. In 2008, we created a community of practice with corporations and nonprofits that included Out and Equal, and released a report in 2009, and that's still up on the website. Updated it in 2012, and also in 2012, the Corporate Equality Index began to include using self-ID as one of their metrics for organizational competency. At that point, 35% of the companies used self-ID, and in 2017 report, 46% of the companies report using either the confidential HR records or anonymous survey data. But why is this so important? It's really about being aware of yourself, that it's safe to be out at work, being counted, and then being heard. And that helps to provide inputs to corporations about the policies that are being created and what's the workplace climate, and are you supporting your LGBT employees. And there's a difference between identity, this is who I am, versus this is something you found out about me, coming out, that process about who I am. And the identity is an important part there, and using the intersectionality discussion, it brings who we are at work. And we see a lot of work being done on the federal level. The 2010 census data collected information on same-sex partner head of households. The Health People 2010 looked at LGBT, and the Federal Viewpoint Survey since 2012 has been working on that. We're going to talk today and give you some more insights into self-ID, talk about why LGBT voluntary self-ID is a business imperative, how do you use that self-ID data, and what are some of the considerations around global self-ID. Go ahead and ask questions as we go through, and then we'll have some closing comments, and Daniel and I will be back at the end. So I'm going to bring up now our panel, and I'm going to ask them real quick just to introduce themselves and where they're from and why they're involved in self-ID. So Chris, let's start with you.
Hi, Chris Crespo. I'm at Ernst & Young, EY, the Center of Excellence for the America's Inclusiveness Team, and I focus on our LGBT inclusion efforts as part of my day job now going forward. I also work with all of our professional networks.
Great. Tim?
Thanks, Pat. Hi, it's Tim here. I also work at EY, but I'm based in London, working for our UK and Ireland practice. And one of part of my job in our diversity and inclusiveness team over here is looking at the LGBT and issues, LGBT agenda, but also I lead on employee self-identification for the UK and Ireland firm. So that's why I'm on the call. Thanks.
Excellent. Kim?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Messer. I've been with IBM for 17 years, and I'm based in Toronto, Ontario. And I'm a member of IBM's Global Diversity Business Development Team focused on workforce diversity in LGBT markets, both in Canada and the U.S. And I'm also the co-chair of IBM Canada's LGBT Business Resource Group.
Excellent. And Marina?
Hi, thanks, Pat. I'm Marina Williams, and I am the Director of Equal Opportunity Programs here at Lockheed Martin. My team is part of the larger Global Diversity and Inclusion Organization. And our Equal Opportunity Programs team, we focus on the development and the implementation of strategy across the enterprise in support of it maintaining a compliant posture, primarily as it relates to the OSCCP and the EEOC. And we also provide on an as-needed basis some compliance support to our international colleagues across the enterprise. But the bulk of our work is in the U.S. We are part of global diversity and inclusion, and the management of self-ID is within the wheelhouse of our program.
Excellent, thanks. And Jacob chatted in that he's great to have all the speakers here and great to see an IBMer. So we're going to get started and get the information to you. And so the first thing that we're going to ask each of the companies to kind of talk about is self-ID and how is it a business imperative. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and we'll get started there. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Pat. This slide hopefully gives you a little bit of a depiction. As many of you know, we're a professional services firm, and as such, we like our numbers, and we always like going back to what the numbers show us. So a large part of our business case around self-identification was really understanding not only our workforce, but also understanding how it impacts our productivity and our overall retention and engagement. So we'll talk a little about some of that, but it is around really helping us capture that data right up front. And as a big part of that, there's also an element of being able to share with everyone really what the benefits are to them. So there's pieces of the business case that relate mainly to this data and how best to use the data, but also in understanding our workforce and the engagement and productivity of our workforce. We also look to make sure that we've identified and clarified what's in it for everyone personally. And so those two pieces kind of go hand in hand as we tell the story. As you see here, when you look at the data and where we actually have found overall, anytime that we are measuring and we are showing what our data can show us, we've been able to look at not only what the external side has seen on data, but also internally we've actually validated it within EY as to what data has been able to show us. So when you look at higher gross margin, higher retention, higher overall revenue growth, and you can tie that back to being able to look at the numbers of who you have involved from a diverse perspective, that helps to itself make the business case and show how we need to almost go back to the beginning and almost chicken and the egg effect, if you will. If you don't know who the people are who are diverse, then you can't tell their story. But at the same time, you need to be able to count each other in order to be able to tell that story as well. Tim, you want to talk a little bit about why we do that? I think I did that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Chris. So as Pat alluded to earlier in her introduction, self-ID comes in all different shapes and sizes within an organization. So it can be your HR system where it ties back to a name, so that's the individual actually self-identifying that they are happy that the organization can tie their self-ID data back to a name. There's all staff satisfaction surveys, which are usually anonymous, which it enables you to measure the attitudes of your staff and cut that data by different diversity demographics to really get to understand how your people are feeling from different groups. There's also recruitment data, so you can track your people that are coming in, who is applying to your organisation, who's coming through your recruitment process. You can see if you're attracting a particular group or you're not attracting a particular group. So you can see whether if there are areas where you might need to improve. And then there's also your employee resource groups who could perhaps do member surveys. So obviously that's limited to their members, but still, particularly your LGBT staff, employee resource groups, that can give some insight into how they're feeling as well. So that's another form of self-ID, probably a much more informal one than some of the others, but that is another form. And for us, we see it that there are kind of three stages, and it's a bit of a virtuous circle, that it's all well and good to monitor, to go out and ask the question, ask people to self-ID, but then you have to really reflect on that data and say, what is that data showing us? Is it showing us some great best practice where we're doing some good stuff, and that's brilliant, where we can continue and we can learn to spread that across the organization? But is it also showing us areas of concern, areas where we need to improve? So, for example, if you have a prefer not to say option on your monitoring, on your self-ID options, and a whole section of your business is answering that question on the sexual orientation side of things, obviously something is going on in that part of the business, which means that people, for whatever reason, don't feel comfortable declaring their sexual orientation. So it enables you to then go and have a look and see what's going on. But then you also have to take action. There's no point collecting this data and reflecting on it if you're then not going to do something about it. And once you have done something about it, you then have to see how that's impacted the issue. So you then have to monitor again, reflect on the data again. So it's a kind of ongoing process and an ongoing virtuous circle that can really help build over time and improve things. So that's how we see it anyway at EY. So I'm going to pass over to Kim, who's going to give a perspective from IBM. So hopefully this will pass on. Yeah, there you go.
Great. Thank you so much. So first of all, just let me say that I'm so pleased to be here on the call today representing IBM and sharing our experiences on self-ID. Wonderful. So IBM introduced Self-ID in 2006 in the United States, and over the past 11 years, we've actually expanded to 34 countries around the world. And I know we're going to touch on the global impact of self-identification a little bit later in the call, so I'll save the details of that. But what is self-identification at IBM? So self-identification is a field in our HR system which employees can use on a voluntary basis to identify themselves as a member of the LGBT constituency. And there's really a few aspects of IBM's implementation that I wanted to share with everyone on the call today. The first is that it's important that our employees have the ability to update this information at any time. So at IBM, the Self-ID tool is part of an employee's HR profile. So this is the same profile as where you would store things like your home address, your emergency contact, banking information, etc. And of course, identifying is completely voluntary. Secondly, it's really important that employees are able to access this tool at any time during their employment, because an employee's sexual orientation status can certainly change over time. So we introduced the tool at employee onboarding, and we also promote the tool on an annual basis during the month of June, which IBM recognizes globally as Pride Month. And I would say likely the most critical element of any deployment that you might be considering in your company is confidentiality. So at IBM, your selections are not seen by your manager, they're not seen by your local HR leaders, and in IBM's case, it's accessible to only two people. The first is our global LGBT talent leader, and yes, we have a global LGBT talent leader, and the data administrator who manages that database. Waiting for my slides. They're a little slow. All right, great. So why is voluntary self-identification important to IBM? So the LGBT population is an invisible population. I think we can likely all agree that certainly this is an important consideration when we're thinking about self-ID. Voluntary self-identification is the only official means through which we can identify this population. And also, the information is being collected to support IBM's global diversity programs. At IBM, we view voluntary self-identification as really a key first step for any organization to understand their diverse employee populations and then to design an effective professional development program for them. We also want to be able to provide equal opportunities to all of our underrepresented groups and minorities, and that certainly includes our LGBT employees. So why do we ask? So I mentioned a moment ago, self-identification is the only means we have to identify an otherwise invisible population. Counting the number of employees who feel comfortable enough to identify in any given country really gives us an indication of the local workplace climate, the level of local management support, and of course the effectiveness of our LGBT programs. So really self-ID data can tell us a lot about our workforce. So there are a few specific aspects that self-identification really help us drill down on, and one is population size. How big is the LGBT population in a particular country or region? Like so many things in our respective companies, what gets measured matters. And I like to use the example of India, where we have 100,000 employees. When we launched Self-ID in 2013, we had 1,000 employees self-identify. And we've seen that number increase each time we advance LGBT inclusive policies and programs in this region. Most recently in 2016, offering domestic partner health benefits to our employees in India. And I'm also pleased to say earlier this year, we actually introduced sex reassignment surgery benefits to transitioning employees in India as well. And both times when we made these announcements, we saw upticks in our self-identification. Representation in corporate hierarchy. Do we see LGBT people represented in all levels of the company and in all regions? What about access to services? Are we providing the right level of services to meet the needs of the community? I mean, at IBM, we're working towards global benefit equity for all of our employees, and certainly self-ID data can really be helpful in building that business case. Are there barriers to recruitment? Are LGBT underrepresented in parts of our business, and how can we perhaps adjust our hiring and recruitment practices to ensure we're hiring the best talent? And also, it's valuable in measuring engagement, satisfaction, and well-being of your diverse communities. So in our case, we often cross-reference the self-ID data with our annual engagement surveys. And it also, of course, helps us target our inclusion programs where it is needed most. Now I'm going to pass it over to Marina, and we're going to hear how Lockheed Martin is approaching self-ID.
Thank you. And thank you for moving that slide for me, Kim. At Lockheed Martin, we've been collecting self-ID information for some period of time, as it has been required by the government. You know, as a federal contractor, we are of a size and meet the criteria for some standard government reporting that, of course, asks us to solicit the voluntary participation of our employees in identifying themselves by race, ethnicity, gender, protected veteran status, and also as individuals having a disability as defined by the OFCCP. So recently, a couple years ago, the government agencies started, compliance agencies started proposing some changes which were enacted to some of these regulations to require some changes to the information that we collect and how we collect it, primarily around VEVRA, which is the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Act, and Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. And again, for contractors required to solicit this information, it sets some guidelines around the expectations of inviting employees to self-ID in particular categories. So whenever that happens, and we have to take a step back and we look at, okay, so what's the impact? What do we need to do to implement these changes? And as part of the assessment of those changes to meet those requirements, we had the opportunity to put a holistic lens on that assessment and evaluate the possibility of expanding our self-ID categories beyond those which we had historically been required to collect. And just to kind of roll it back a little bit, how we look at global diversity and inclusion at Lockheed Martin, we look at it as a continuum, and we recognize that the compliance piece is kind of the foundation. We recognize that we start with the legislation and adhering to the laws, and we move into the regulations and the expectations for us, the federal contractor, to act affirmatively, to cast a wider net and increase our outreach. And then we look at diversity, which is beyond that expected representation that's associated with affirmative action, and it's a broader definition, and then into that inclusion, which is the full utilization of the skills, talents, and abilities to which we have access. And because of that, when we do look at compliance, we do try to put that holistic lens on it and say, now how does this move us forward as well from a diversity and inclusion perspective? So we did that, and we looked at this opportunity to have these expanded categories, and we have received feedback. As a global diversity and inclusion team, we have received feedback internally from our LGBT employee resource groups and leadership forums, as well as our military veterans population beyond protected veterans. And these populations, these communities were asking us, why can't we expand our self-ID? Because we want to be recognized through this same system, this same process. So as an organization, Lockheed Martin is committed to a work environment that attracts and retains the best quality people without regard to characteristics that define their individuality. So we implemented expanded self-ID categories in 2015 to include LGBT and the broader military veterans categories to continue to build on our efforts to create the most inclusive work environment possible for the employees on our Lockheed Martin team. So with those changes in place, with the implementation in our systems and the ability to do this, to provide this opportunity for employees to voluntarily self-ID in these broader categories, in 2016 we launched a comprehensive campaign to educate employees on self-ID. So part of inclusion in the workplace is about being able to bring your whole self to work and making a conscious decision about voluntary participation in self-ID. We feel that supports that inclusion mindset. So we took this opportunity, again, to leverage an element of compliance to bolster our inclusion efforts, and we moved on this. In developing the campaign, we didn't just sit in a vacuum and do it. We engaged with our internal employee resource group partners to both define and execute the awareness of the effort. So we leveraged our communities, our internal communities, to get feedback, to get an understanding. Where were their questions? Where were their gaps in understanding? What is this self-ID What is it? How do we use it? How does it benefit us? We work together to develop the messaging around self-ID, around diversity and inclusion as it's associated with self-ID. And we were very mindful of setting the stage for an understanding of the broader definition of diversity while still not diluting the elements that are associated with the requirements that we have for our government reporting. So our employee teams across all communities have supported the development of this campaign, whether it's from developing and delivering the messaging to actually delivering some of the education to promote the awareness. And this team of Lockheed employees has worked together in developing the branding and marketing materials, and a number of the employees involved even agreed to lend their stories and share their personal self-ID choices as part of the marketing materials. And one of the things that came out of this team as well is the campaign slogan and logo that you see at the bottom of the slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pat so she can move us to the next element.
Excellent. And it's great to see the different perspectives between the companies and how this is rolled out and how it has happened. We've been getting some great questions coming in, and we'll get those during the Q&A. But let's talk about, now you've got the program in place, how are you going to use that data? So Kim, let me turn it over to you first on that.
Thank you so much. So just like Pat said, so now you've got this data, what do you do with it? So at IBM, we use this data directly in our talent and leadership development identification program. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how we do that. So we host an annual SVP review of the high potential LGBT population around the globe. So this happens as part of our LGBT Global Council, which is made up of IBM's out executives, and there's currently 33 globally. And it's also co-chaired by 3 of IBM's most senior LGBT and ally champions, and this would include both general managers and senior vice presidents. So at IBM, how do we know who the top LGBT talent are globally? So on an annual basis, if you can follow all the acronyms, there's a lot of acronyms here, IBM and otherwise. On an annual basis, IBM managers evaluate their employees as part of a BTL program. So we call that Business and Technical Leadership, which identifies high potential employees with leadership and executive potential. So that program applies to every employee in the company once they reach a certain level in the organization. So that data is cross-referenced with our self-ID flag to generate a list of top LGBT talent globally. So that group is then invited to targeted leadership development opportunities. I can tell you over the past 10 years, we've used the Out and Equal Workplace Summit to bring together anywhere from 35 to 40 top talent LGBT employees from around the world to attend the conference and then attend an IBM Leadership Day with members of our executive population. And we typically tack that on to the last day of the summit. I've also included a few photos here of our most recent participation at the summit in Orlando. We also run webinars, trainings, and other internal and external programs to support this very talented community. As I stated earlier, the data in the self-ID tool is highly confidential. So you might be asking yourself, how are we able to invite employees to leadership development opportunities if we don't know who they are? So when an employee self-identifies, they're provided an additional opportunity to opt in to communication from IBM Global Diversity pertaining to HR programs, learning opportunities, and leadership training that may be of interest to them. So through this 2-step opt-in process, we're able to communicate with our employees. So I'm now going to pass it back to Marina and hear how Lockheed Martin is leveraging this data.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I do have to tell you, Kimberly, I was taking some notes on some things you said because as we continue to evolve, I'm interested in some of the things that you just shared about IBM. So how we use the data? Well, I will tell you that with our expanded categories, we do have the ability to look at the data in the aggregate. And generally, again, limited access to the data. There are pretty much 2 people in the company who have access to view the data. We've been collecting self-ID information on required self-ID categories for some time, so we do have some pretty robust systems and processes in place for use of any sort of information that's associated with the self-ID and guidelines around its use for legitimate business purposes. And we do leverage we do leverage the information to help to inform our diversity and inclusion efforts, directionally, understanding population densities and dearths, and use that to help inform some of the decisions we make about where do we direct our discretionary resources. For the expanded self-ID, a lot of our work right now, take it back to the campaign, is focusing the efforts on promoting the awareness and participation. So we've really been focusing a lot on the messaging for that awareness and a greater understanding. And we are seeing, it is still early. We're a very large company, and I think I'm going to try to answer one of the questions that I saw pop up in the box. Our self-ID efforts, and especially, I know we're here to talk about focus more on LGBT. That's domestic. Right now, that is maintained domestically within the U.S., and we will continue to, as we continue to evolve, work with the appropriate teams internally and our workforce to understand, how, when, and where we can expand all of our expanded self-ID information or collection. So anywho, from our campaign, we have seen that awareness has increased. We've seen upticks in employee visits to the self-ID tool. We're able to see that uptick in visits, as it's associated with some of our major pushes for awareness and education, and as our employee resource groups are having events and activities to share information about self-ID across the enterprise. And that's a result we had hoped for. So again, in expanding this and increasing the awareness, especially for the newer categories, seeing that people are interested and are going to get more information is meeting the mark. So with that, I believe that I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm loving how differently each of us have these slightly different approaches to things. And I think that it's going to continue on. I love this stuff. The HR system versus employee survey is two different ways that we capture our LGBT self-identification right now at EY. And so I wanted to kind of break out. There are differences in how we approach the information. And a little bit like what we see in some of the other companies, we have confidentiality around this data. But we actually open ours up a little more broadly, at least in the U.S., and I'll let Tim chime in about the U.K. in a little bit. But on the U.S. side, we actually have our data open to all HR at the upper levels so that it can be used to the same extent that it's being evaluated and used with other levels. So, for example, on the HR side of things, the analysis of workforce piece is really something that we look at not only as a representation piece and look at it by level and different service lines and different departments that we have, but also our recruits, our new hires, our promotion levels and advancement levels, and then those who are leaving us, whether or not there's any differences there from an LGBT perspective compared to what we're seeing in the non-LGBT community. And then when you look more at the employee survey, which is the anonymous tool that we have within the firm, we actually ask a slightly different question there. So with self-ID, we ask a question on sexual orientation, and then we ask a question on gender identity expression. While on the employee survey, we have each of those questions, but as part of that, we have a third question, which asks if people are out in the workplace. So the information that we can look at from the employee survey actually gives us a little bit of a deeper dive into not only that representation piece that we can also compare back to the HR piece I can add, so these tools can kind of work together. But then we can also look at things that are measured within the employee survey, like engagement levels. And engagement levels have been shown to have a direct correlation with productivity and revenue growth, as we showed on that original slide. So we look to see the engagement levels of our LGBT professionals, or those who are identifying as LGBT, comparable to those who are not identifying as LGBT. And we've also been able to do that comparison with LGBT people who are out and those who are not out. And that, frankly, is where we found the biggest difference. We found that those who are not out have a lower level of engagement than those who are LGBT and those who are non-LGBT, but those who are out. Hope that makes sense. But then we can also then dive into the different questions that come up via the survey and look at them from an LGBT who are out and LGBT who are not out in the workplace, as well as non-LGBT. With every one of these questions, though, whether it's the HR system or the employee survey, we have the option of prefer not to answer, and that gives us that option to know how many people have actually responded to the question and how many people do not want to respond to the question, but have at least acknowledged looking at it. And that gets you to your overall response rate, which has a little bit of a different piece. And that actually ends up being one of the biggest challenges that I think we all talk about when we get together to talk about self-identification. So we wanted to use a minute to also talk about some of the things that we've done that we found useful in actually encouraging self-ID. So there's that level of trust first that needs to be built up around how you're going to use the data. And I think you've heard some examples of how we each do that a little bit differently and how we deploy that. But then there's also just the plain old, how do you get people past that empathetic state of needing to click the button and go into the system and actually update it. So there are some general things that you see on this slide here that talk through some of the different things that we do around encouraging people. I had to laugh because recently we had people applying to go to our conferences, and as some of you know, we send some larger groups to conferences. But as part of that, one of the initial questions for making your application to attend a conference had the question of, have you completed your self-ID? And so we saw an uptick in our self-ID the month that our applications went out for conferences. So you look for all those little different ways that you can tie it to either an event or that you can tie it into a process like your new hire process or the orientation process, even compensation process. We've talked about how to tie it in with some of the different pieces that we have with the benefits with our benefits going out, and just simply asking the question, have you identified yet? And here's the link, and clarifying within our websites then as to what the benefits are over and over again, because it often comes back to what's in it for me as to why people do or do not. And with that, I'll take you to the next slide, because as you can see, it can take a long time to build up that response rate for these kinds of questions. So being totally transparent here, it has taken quite a while, and the U.S. numbers are looking very similar to the U.K. numbers right now. But Tim, can you give us some quick insight as to why we saw the huge jump from 2015 to 2017?
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, it is a sneakily jumping 2 years there, with all the other years being a jump of one. But it is a significant jump, that we, when we were looking back to when we first introduced the measure on our HR system in 2009 to 2017, it was quite a steady growth, and there was a bit of a plateau. But then we did a really big, and I'll talk a bit more about it towards in the next section. But we did a fairly large communications campaign out to our people to encourage them to self-identify in that interim period between 2015 and 2017, coupled with a number of other things. So working much closer with our recruitment team and our onboarding team, so the team that then deal with with our new people as they join the firm, to make sure that we got measures put in to things like our new joiner form, for example. So when people join EY in the UK, we have a form that we ask them to complete, which includes things like their bank details and things like that. And we have all of the diversity measures put into that form now. So as people are coming into the firm, they're asked that information, and we've seen that has caused a big increase. Someone asked a question about new employees and how how they know, or how they get comfortable being so new with an organisation, self-identifying. And I think, at least for us in the UK, it's not an unusual thing for people to see. It's been quite normal for UK organisations to ask these questions for a long time. So people have a general kind of expectation that they may get asked to self-identify as they come into an organisation. And whilst that won't allay a lot of fears, it does kind of set a bit of a baseline. And to help kind of improve on that, we make sure that in our induction process, before they get to that form, it's very, very clear to them. It's made clear to them, how important we see open and inclusive culture at the firm. We make sure that they feel comfortable when they come in and that they can see that it's okay to be themselves at EY. And so even in those first days at the firm, it's really hammered home to them just how important this is to us as an organisation. So that is really important from day one. In a broader inclusion sense, if you really right from day one make people understand just how important this agenda is to you as an organisation, and that them being able to be themselves at the organisation is so important to you, and have some information about the fact that that you do self-identify, you do ask for self-identification data and why you ask for it, so that right there and then in their induction, you're talking about the fact that you collect this data and giving them examples about how you use it to affect positive change in the organisation can really help make them see right from the start that it's something that hopefully they should feel comfortable, they can feel comfortable doing, but also making sure that, as I said, we've seen, as those numbers show, a big jump coupled with a few other things, but a real big jump in the number of declarations that we've had. But also making it clear to people that they can go in and change that. They can go in at any time and update that information. So if at first they don't feel comfortable, they can go in any time to, they can go in and prefer not to say, but then they can, later down the road change that if they want, and then declare. So you're not forcing them to do it right away. It's still optional. It's still just there, and it's up to them what they declare. It's in their hands. But yeah, we're really happy to see the jump that we've seen in declaration rates, and it's in fact, since I put this slide together, it's gone up slightly again. So it takes a while, but it will go up. Just stick with it. Don't expect you to be able to click your fingers and it's done overnight, because it does take a while. And so now I'm going to pass over to Pat again, I think, to intro the next section.
Great, thanks, Tim. And I know we've always warned people with that about a slow start and people seeing what the company is going to do with it. But it really sounds like that these are some great tools to, permeate it through the entire company and sort of culture and value. But let's talk about a lot of the work that we've done, and we started this effort kind of within the U.S. And Tim's alluded to doing some of the global aspects. And Marina, you had mentioned that you were doing this just in the U.S. Well, why don't you talk about kind of what next steps are for you on the global side?
So I will share that as we continue as a company to grow our business internationally, we're also always looking at that from a diversity and inclusion perspective too. How do we enhance and leverage the global diversity of our workforce and continue to promote inclusion? We have an Executive Inclusion Council that sponsors efforts to engage the global workforce. So we have the opportunity to pulse through that council to understand what are the wants, needs, desires of the communities across the enterprise outside of the U.S. And with getting that feedback, what we're doing is we're working in partnership with our legal team, and we're revisiting opportunities regularly, our legal team and their privacy subject matter experts, because that's a huge concern, and I think that was shared by in the IBM. Kimberly shared it early in her presentation too, that privacy piece. So we work closely with our legal team and the privacy subject matter experts to evaluate what data we collect and where we collect that data. So it's something that's on the table, and we continue to pulse and look for ways that we can expand that self-ID collection. So with that, I'll say more to come. And then I think now I pass the baton to Tim, if I can get him on the right slide.
Thanks. So back again, wanting to give you some examples of the differences that can happen depending on what country you're in, and the fact that there will be differences if you're doing this globally, depending on what location you're in. We've put together a bit of a timeline showing the difference between our UK and Ireland practice and our USA and Canada. And just to show you the differences that have happened, we obviously have self-ID in all those locations. the implementation of it has differed, and there's been a different timeline for each location. So as you can see on that slide, we started in the United Kingdom a long time ago, back in 2007, by having a self-ID question on sexual orientation on our internal people survey, on our staff satisfaction survey, which then moved on to us implementing it on our HR system in 2009, well, in the UK, and at that point Ireland added the question to the staff satisfaction survey. So, even within the UK and Ireland, we were on a different track because two different countries, very close together, but different legal and different legislative makeups, different approaches, and different places in their diversity journey. And then over across the pond, over in the USA and Canada, self-ID in 2008 was added to the to the self-satisfaction survey in the USA, whilst Canada operated a kind of separate system. So they operated a census questionnaire that was kind of a bespoke way of collecting the data. So it was kind of neither staff satisfaction survey and neither HR system. It was like a proprietary kind of way of collecting the data for their purposes. And then fast forward along, and that's on sexual orientation. As we go along, you can see that gender identity then kind of becomes added, because obviously they are different things. And so as the organisations in different locations build on their diversity agenda, build on their knowledge and their agenda, they will add different things, and they'll start measuring different things. So we've sort of gradually built upon the questions as we've gone along, both on our satisfaction survey and then on the HR system. And as Chris alluded to earlier, we've also started adding on the satisfaction survey additional questions that start exploring how out you are in the workplace. And whether you're out to clients, for example, because that gives us another really valuable measure to see, hey, it's great to know, if our people are LGBT or if indeed they identify something other than those four buckets. But it's also almost even more important to then understand how out they are in the workplace, because if we've got loads of LGBT people in the workplace, but none of them are out and none of them feel comfortable being out, that's not a great position to be in. So, you need to understand, the bigger picture if you can. So yeah, that's just a slide just to give you, as I said, an example on how things can move at different paces depending on where you are in the world, and you shouldn't just try to implement a one-size-fits-all solution for everywhere. It's really important, particularly with self-ID, to really take the time to get to do it right in each location, and don't push people too far too early. Just make sure that it goes at the right pace, and you bring people along on the journey with you. And then just to give you a few little examples of some of the ways we've tried to help encourage self-identification in our different locations. So I'll give you an example from the USA and then one from the UK and Ireland. So first, the USA is the I Count campaign that the US or the Americas firm put together, and this was around trying to really show people that that self-ID is a big thing, and it's a big, we're talking about large amounts of data, but it's really also it really comes down to the individual, and that you count as an individual, and by submitting your data and declaring your data on the system, you're helping contribute to the bigger picture, but you as an individual count. You are part of that. So it was a really good campaign that the Americas have put together, and as Chris has kind of alluded to earlier, they've seen their declaration rates gradually increase since they introduced the HR system self-ID. I mean, it's largely through campaigns like this that really engage with the people in the organisation and really make the case for why what's in it for them, why should they put that data on the HR system, why should they put that data on the staff satisfaction survey, how is that contributing to the organisation, why is it important, as others have spoken to as well, who is going to have access to that data, what are you going to use it for, because people need to feel comfortable, they need to have that trust in the organisation. They do declare that data and they do self-ID, that they know that data isn't going to be misused. It's going to be there. Respect, it's going to be secure, and it's going to be used to affect positive change in the organisation. It's not just going to sit there on the HR system doing nothing, that people are actually going to be using it to affect change. So that's the iCount campaign in the USA. And then in the UK and Ireland firm, we took a slightly different approach. We've done a number of campaigns over the years, as you can imagine. Things that we've been doing it in various guises since 2007 over here. But this was our most recent campaign, which was done over the last year. And so we kind of took a slightly different tact in that we decided that we were going to ask people, rather than use the language of declaration and use the language of trying to make it seem like it was a big statement that people were making, we decided that we were going to try a different tact and use the language of sharing. So we are aware that we're asking somebody to share something about themselves that's personal and really important to them. So that was the language we used. So it's all about sharing what makes you you, and all the different parts that make you the unique individual that you are. And we used mosaic imagery, trying to be like there's all these different pieces that come together to make the bigger picture of what you are, of who you are as an individual. And then likewise, all of the data that people share with us comes together and builds a much bigger picture of our organisation. And as you can see from this was kind of this example I've put on the screen it prints out and folds together into like a little three-sided stand-up thing that goes on tables around the business. But we had posters, interactive displays running around all of our offices and things as well, with all of this data, and coupled with news stories in our newsletters and things, really setting the case, as I said, for why we're asking for this data, what's in it for you, what's the value of sharing your data, and why is it important to us as an organisation, and how to do it as well. So you'll see there's a little thing that says click this button on EY Help, which is our kind of one-stop shop for HR things and all sorts of stuff, technology, all sorts. And so there's a little button on the front page of that says very clearly share your D&I data. You click on that, it takes you right to where you can share it. So that's just a couple of examples of how different, again, you can take a different approach in different locations to encourage people. Sometimes an overall campaign can work across a global business, but also sometimes you do need to do a different approach that's more tailored to the individual situation on the ground. So that's just a few examples from us. And I think I'm now passing back over to Kim, who's going to give some final insights from IBM. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Kim. Greatly appreciated. So as I stated earlier, IBM introduced self-ID in 2006 in the U.S., and we rolled it out to other countries soon after. And certainly over the past 11 years, we've introduced self-ID in 34 countries, and I've put the list of countries here for your reference. So we now make this option available to 86% of our global workforce, and we're very, very proud of that accomplishment. So this is probably a topic I get asked about most often, certainly how we've gone about implementing this in some countries and regions of the world where certainly the perception is that it should be very difficult to do so. So I'm just going to provide some insights to how we go about that. So what factors influence where we do and do not currently implement self-ID? So today the LGBT indicator is deployed around the world in all regions, but certainly not in all countries due to local privacy regulations. We continue deployment wherever local legislation allows us to collect this information, and that's a continual evaluation that certainly countries that are not on this list today, we continue to evaluate on an annual basis. So you may be surprised that some of the countries in Europe are missing from this list, and it's not just about the local political or legal climate for LGBT people. Of course, that's a factor, but what you'll notice in this list of countries, and I know Pat alluded to that at the opening of the call, we've successfully deployed the tool in a number of countries where being gay is in some form considered illegal by local laws. But really, Europe has proven to be one of the regions where it's most difficult to deploy, and I'm going to give you some insights as to why that is. Certainly, data privacy laws play a huge factor in where and how you implement the tool around the world. So what are a few of the specific limitations that we've faced over the years in a given country? So there's really three main reasons why we would not deploy voluntary self-ID for the LGBT population. First of all, because it's illegal in the country to collect and store LGBT data. So this would be something that would apply in a lot of EU countries. So many EU countries have very strict data privacy regulations, which really date back to their experiences of the Second World War, which for obvious reasons, the risks associated in collecting personal information on large groups of people that perhaps could be used against them. And I know Pat also specifically called out France. And I know for us, we can't deploy in France because of these privacy regulations and a specific government body that's asked us not to collect it. So it's essentially against the law in France today. The second reason we do not implement self-ID in a given country is because we as a company have decided that it's not safe for an employee to provide this information to us, though it might be legal to collect it. So I can give you the example of Egypt, where certainly being LGBT is legal in Egypt, yet the police continue to raid gay bars and occasionally make arrests. So we don't want to have this type of information on our employees if we know that the authorities may perhaps make negative use of it. Thirdly, there can also be technical reasons for not deploying. Some countries don't allow data to be stored outside of the country itself. And, we're living in a cloud-based world where, often data is stored outside of countries. But really, ultimately, it's about employee safety. We certainly don't deploy in any country where there's a death penalty for being LGBT, which sadly, there's still a number of countries where that remains true. I'm just going to close. I know we wanted to leave some time for questions, and we're running kind of a bit over, but I'll just close with a brief comment about India, because I know for many of our multinationals, that's a big market for them. We could deploy in India because there's no legislation that says you cannot collect or store this data. Yes, they have an old sodomy law, which is still in the book, but technically being LGBT is illegal. However, this law has not been enforced, and we therefore made the decision that we could collect the data without this being a security threat to our employees, and this goes for Singapore as well. And we introduced self-ID in India in 2013, just as a reference. And I can tell you, just as a final bit of IBM trivia, we have more LGBT people self-identified in India than any other country in which we operate. And we're in just about every country around the world. So on that note, I will pass it back to Pat, and I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Kim, that was great. I do have a general question. A lot of people are asking questions around recruiting and retention, and how do you do that with talent acquisition. And I know, Chris and Tim, you talked a little bit about how you encourage people to sign up. But can we go through and kind of see, what are you doing with recruiters? How's that working, and when does self-ID happen for you? So, Chris?
Yeah, it does not happen until they're employed. So we don't do it through the recruiting process, but we do it once they've joined us as a new hire. But it is part of our onboarding process then with the onboarding process.
Okay, Kim?
Exactly the same for IBM. Absolutely do not ask that question prior to onboarding. And I guess all I could say in terms of if your company is looking to hire diverse talent, what the best that we can do is position ourselves at diverse recruiting events and hope that we attract candidates through that mechanism, but we really have no way of knowing until they're with the company.
Sounds good. And Marina?
Yes, same here as a part of onboarding.
Excellent. Robin asked
and just
a really
to
good
jump
question.
in, Pat,
Oh, go ahead, Tim. Sorry about that.
Just to give a slight difference in locations and things in the UK, we do ask the question at application stage. So in addition to all other the other major D&I demographics, but the way it works in the UK, because as part of equal opportunities, is that the question is asked, but then the information has to be legally separated from the candidate's CV. So we can get data from a sexual orientation point of view on our applicants, but it's not linked to the person's name, if that makes sense.
Okay, great.
So we have to ask them again. We have to ask them again when they join the organisation, because we can't bring it back and join it back up at the end of the process. It has to be totally separated from the CV. So you do have to ask them again on onboarding.
That's great. I know, Tim, you talked a little bit about the UK and the jump in identifying is going. Robin asked a good question just in general. Are we starting to see any backlash, especially in the United States, with the new administration about people changing their status or their identification or wanting to remove it? Anything on that, Kim from IBM?
I am so sorry, Pat. I was reading a question in the chat. Bad me.
No
bad
problem.
Me. I apologize.
Yeah. No, the question was, are you seeing any reactions and backlashing in terms of people wanting to remove their identification and their records or anything like that?
We have not, but I do know there's some external, like not-for-profit organizations who've done some general polling, with LGBT people, and certainly there is some fear and some folks expressing concern that they may want to go back in the closet or certainly considering that. But as a company, we haven't really had, a strong indication of people reaching out internally at this point.
And Marina, how about with Lockheed?
No, with regard to the LGBT self-ID, we have not. I am not aware of any backlash. I haven't gotten any negative feedback.
Sounds good. Chris, from the U.S.?
We have not. In fact, our numbers, response rates have gone up. I think we've actually found the information more useful because even when we started with HB2 in North Carolina, we actually reached out through the self-ID information to communicate back with our people who identified and let them know that if they were going to North Carolina, this is what they could expect from the firm, how to check in, that kind of thing. And so we did some particular outreach that people started learning about and learning how it actually was almost a safety mechanism in some respects.
Sounds good. And we've got some other questions. Some of them are very mechanical and kind of asking specifics. But I'm going to ask our presenters if they would blog us some answers, and we'll get that out to everybody because I want to give them a minute or two here to do some closing comments and last thoughts. So from EY, Chris and Tim, last thoughts.
Just go out and do it. This is a hard one. If you need help, reach out to the people who are on the call and find us because all you need to do is get started. And once you get started, it starts to build on its own, but it does take time.
Yeah, and I'd just add that, I'd echo what Chris has said, but also, also think when you're planning, if you're planning to do self-ID, is make sure that you know what you're going to use the data for afterwards. Don't just collect the data because you want to be seen to be collecting it and you think that you have to be collecting it. Make sure that you're collecting it for a reason, that it's going to help you drive change. There's no point collecting and going through all the going through the process of getting all this implemented and everything to collect that information if you're not then going to use it to affect positive change in your organization. So make sure you're clear about what you're going to use it for. But yeah, go for it and reach out to those organizations like ours on the call and others who have already on that journey or have already been on that journey and use us to help accelerate you.
Sounds good. Kim?
And for me, I just echo both their comments. Please reach out to us. I mean, our names are there. Find us on LinkedIn. Get our emails from Pat. Happy to engage with any of you on the call today, and certainly IBM is willing to help you in this journey. So thank you.
Great. And Marina?
Same here. I'll say ditto for all of my co-presenters here today. I agree. I have to reinforce what Tim said. Anytime you collect data, you should collect data with a purpose. Understand how you're going to use it and how you're going to protect it. And again, I am available. I can be reached on LinkedIn as well for any questions.
Sounds good. I want to thank each of you for all the information and working on these projects. It's an important way that we get this information out to other organizations. And as listeners, thank you for calling in and all the questions. Again, we'll send up a follow-up email with the recording and the slide deck, and we'll get some of these answers out. Our next town call is going to be April 27th about the ROI for health benefits for transgender employees. Please complete the survey at the end of the call. And if you've got any questions, please reach out to myself or Daniel and let us know. And we'll see you next month. Thanks, and stay proud.